Why, hello. The spirits have told me this is the end of season 1. But don't fret. Season 2 is right around the corner. Thank you so much for listening and giving us your support. It's been a blast going on this journey with you, and we hope you got as much out of it as we did. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe with your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. That is the last thing you want haunting you. And be sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Heck, give us a 5-star review on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. Season 2 is right around the corner, but while you wait, check out our other creations like Frenemies. Rivalry can be scary too. And if the spirits are calling you to bring more Toil and Trouble media into your life, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for the owl. And with that, here's episode 12, The Cottingley Fairies. Be warned. The following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. In 1917, a young girl in Cape Town received a letter from her playmate. Delighted, she ripped open the envelope, eager to hear all about the fun she was having in England. Her friend wrote, "I'm learning French, geometry, cookery, and algebra at school now. Dad came home from France the other week after being there 10 months, and we all think the war will be over in a few days." Then she added, "Elsie and I are very friendly with the Beck fairies. Is it funny I never used to see them in Africa? It must be too hot for them there." Inserted amongst the pages was a photo of her friend. And something else. A fairy. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. Unlike the other supernatural scandals profiled on this show, the tale of the Cottingley Fairies stands out, not only for the subject of the hoax, but the players that ultimately perpetrated it. The events which unfolded didn't originate through any malice. There were no grifters or con artists at its inception. And what's more, much of what happened was never intentional at all. It was an innocent prank that flew out of control, and a curious tale of how a small drop of bias can lead many to ignore the truth. That summer, 9-year-old Frances Griffiths and her mother left their home in the Cape Town British colonies to stay with her uncle, Arthur Wright, and her Aunt Polly in England. It was an unsettling time. Frances's father, like many, was conscripted into the forces fighting in World War I, and she wasn't sure when she would see him or home again. But she wouldn't be alone in Cottingley, a village in West Yorkshire. Besides her aunt and uncle, she would be staying with her 16-year-old cousin Elsie. The girls were very close. Frances was practically Elsie's shadow, and in Frances, Elsie had the little sister she'd always dreamed of. They would often play for hours at the far end of the garden, where there was a small stream known as Cottingley Beck. The Beck was the kind of backdrop imagined in storybooks. Picturesque brook framed by rocky outcrops and trees. It butted up against the Wrights' garden and was just the kind of inviting location children loved to explore. It was a kind of green therapy for Frances, who was putting on a brave face for the family, but Elsie suspected was beside herself with worry. And the area quickly became the favored playground, with the girls regularly getting in trouble for returning home late and dirty, traipsing untold remnants of God knows what through the house on soggy shoes. Eventually, exhausted from the constant correction of their irritated mothers, Frances offered up an imaginative child's version of a straightforward explanation. It wasn't her fault. They should blame it on the fairies. They were only out there in the wet and the muck because of them. The excuse was likely seen as flimsy, bearing little more credibility than the time-trusted alibi, "the dog ate my homework." Their parents undoubtedly scoffed and continued to rip them a new one for their wet, dirty clothes. Until one day, determined to support her cousin, Elsie convinced her father to lend her his Midge quarter-plate camera. And off to the Beck they went to bring back proof. The girls returned about an hour later, declaring their mission a triumphant success. Photography was still in its infancy, and in these early stages still involved catching images on chemically treated glass plates inside a bulky box-like contraption. Then, using special materials to develop the images into black and white pictures. An amateur enthusiast in the budding field, Arthur had all the equipment they needed. That evening, he made use of his darkroom and developed the image. The negative, while a little overexposed, was still a pretty decent portrait. Frances was standing on the bank of the Beck. Her head was slightly tilted as she gazed off to Elsie's right. A waterfall and some rocks occupied the background about 20 feet away. In front of her appeared several winged fairies draped in gauzy costumes. Arthur's jaw dropped. But not because he believed the images in front of his eyes. He wasn't daft. He knew there was no such thing as fairies. But there he was, looking at a picture of them. How did they do it? He knew the answer must be staring him in the face. Like any other parental challenge, he just had to walk through the steps. He knew Elsie was a keen photographer in her own right and a talented artist. Once motivated, it would not have taken the teenager long to conceive of a creative way to best them. He could also see Frances was in on the prank. The goofy grin on her face betrayed her struggle to suppress her laughter. And the sprites themselves looked flat and one-dimensional. They were similar enough to the drawings Elsie proudly displayed in her bedroom. But if this was the case, how was she able to put them into the print? A study of the picture didn't get him any closer to the truth. He developed the print himself, so there was no way she doctored it. And Elsie didn't have time to tamper with it beforehand. Once inserted, she would have had no way to remove it without the plate becoming at least partially exposed. As any parent can personally attest, asking the kids directly didn't go much better. The girls crowed at their accomplishment, thrilled they managed to stump them all. They grinned as they insisted the fairies in the photograph were real. They were so confident in their victory, the little dorks didn't even try very hard to keep the ruse going. When he asked why there appeared to be bits of paper in the photo, they simply asked, "What bits of paper?" He had to hand it to them, even if he would never admit as much. 2 months later, the girls borrowed the camera again, this time returning with a photograph of Elsie sitting on the lawn, holding out her hand to a 1-foot-tall gnome. Again, Arthur was stumped. The gnome looked exactly like the ones in the children's books. How did they manage to scramble up a counterfeit the size of a toddler? When the girls were away at school, he searched their bedroom, the home's living spaces, and even the creek bed itself for evidence of the ruse. But he turned up nothing, save for muddy shoes and trousers. Again, he demanded to know how the girls did it, but was met by the same giggles and lame professions that the pictures were genuine. Convinced they must have messed with his camera, Arthur refused to let them use it again. The exasperation was its own reward. The girls made a pact never to confess the secrets of how they took the photographs and continued to razz their family. In time, the incident became nothing more than a puzzling family anecdote. The pictures, an amusing joke shared with relatives and friends. Over the next few years, word of the photographs got around. Frances was a prolific culprit. Like any child able to pull the wool over the eyes of every adult around them, she circulated the prints without a moment's thought that someone would believe they were real. After all, aside from the mystery of how they did it, the images themselves couldn't fool a 12-year-old. Not even her pen pal in Cape Town was taken in, although she wrote back to tell Frances she enjoyed the joke immensely and suggested that perhaps the sprites were picked off by some of the wildlife native to South Africa. As far as the girls were concerned, it was nice to have a silly distraction to take them away from the real threats of war. And after all, everyone was in on it. Well, almost everyone. Elsie's mother, Polly, wasn't so sure. After all, her daughter was just a little girl. She wasn't a photographer or a scientist. Sure, she was clever, but there was no way she could master something so technical and complex as a camera, much less produce a hoax with one, right? In the midst of the Victorian era, the notion that women were intellectually inferior was still accepted as fact, even by other women. To Polly, the idea that the girls really did encounter mythical creatures just seemed more plausible. Try not to be too hard on her. Willingness to believe in fairies, gnomes, and otherworldly beings wasn't a matter of intelligence or education. The Victorians had long been fascinated by the idea of invisible creatures living amongst us, with even the greatest painters and novelists taking them as inspiration. They were popular subjects for mass-market prints, pottery, and ornaments. Even Walt Disney had captured the imagination of children and adults alike with his fantastic cartoons. And like other untested concepts, they were yet another topic picked up by the spiritualist movement. It's not hard to see why. So many were suffering. Food shortages were widespread. Loved ones were lost or wounded, homes broken, and no one was certain when, how, or even if it would end. Alternative theories in the fields of biology challenged not only convention, but reality. Maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. To that end, the populace leaned towards the paranormal. Investigations into all sorts of strange and unusual phenomena became commonplace. Fairy believers were certain they were witness to a cosmic evolution and clamored to be at the forefront of discovery. After many grueling years where optimism was rationed as tightly as fuel, the ability to have loud, angry arguments at the dinner table about the existence of magical creatures was not only forgivable, but in a sense, welcome. For Polly, the idea two simple girls could craft such images was just more than she was willing to accept. That, and the fact that Polly was a member of the local Theosophical Society. That may have had something to do with it, too. The Theosophical Society was a group dedicated to mysticism, spiritualism, and occultism. A conglomeration of religion, philosophy, and pseudoscience, they believed, among other things, in the existence of invisible otherworldly beings and their ability to bestow wisdom and universal brotherhood. But their exploration of the unexplained led to some far-fetched ideas, and a complete lack of evidentiary-based conclusions. The society saw itself on the forefront of human evolution and its members as clergy-like figures. In their quest to guide humanity towards perfection, they often claimed credit for unproven concepts and hesitated to correct disproven ones. In 1919, Polly took copies of the photographs to a lecture about fairies sponsored by the group. Afterwards, she showed them to the speaker, asking him if he thought they might be real. The speaker shared them with the society's sitting president, Edward Gardner. To Polly's delight, her beliefs were validated. Gardner couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the prints, and after some negotiation, was able to acquire the plates for further study. But study was only a small formality. Gardner was already convinced the photos were proof that the next cycle of evolution was underway. And if that was the case, he was sitting on a gold mine. The images were not only significant for the movement, but for him personally. Someone had to go down in history as the discoverer of Fae folk. Why shouldn't it be him? Seizing upon the opportunity, he set about establishing their authenticity. Another small formality. He reached out to photographer Harold Snelling to examine the prints, along with their original plate glass negatives. With his expectations clear, Snelling gave him the answer he paid for. Avoiding the question of whether or not the creatures in the frames were really fairies, he verified the photos weren't altered or tampered, that the prints were single exposure, open-air work, and no trace of studio work was evident. Pleased with the results, Gardner hired him to clarify the images and create new negatives more conducive to reproduction. Once complete, he put in a standing order for several copies he could sell at meetings and lectures. While some remained skeptical, many theosophists were drawn to his convincing portrayal of their expert analysis. The more he insisted his merch was genuine, the more members bought in. By 1920, the images found their way to the desk of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The physician, columnist, and celebrity best-selling author may have had a public image like Sherlock Holmes, but in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. Having suffered the devastating loss of his brother and his son in a very short time, Conan Doyle found solace in all sorts of occult theories and unscrupulous mediums who he believed could speak to the dead. By this time, his convictions were so strong that any sense of objectivity had been cast aside, replaced by a fervor which could be gently described as blind obsession. Shared with him by the editor of The Light, Conan Doyle was immediately intrigued. He had recently been commissioned by the Strand magazine to write an article on fairies for their Christmas issue and wanted to impress. He saw himself not as an artist, but as an apostle. If the article was received favorably, he could use it to help support his other spiritualist beliefs and bring more followers into the fold. The fairy photographs were a godsend, conclusive proof that communication between the material and spiritual worlds was possible. He latched onto the images, convinced that they were the final word in the argument he was so desperate to win. Doyle contacted Gardner that summer to determine the background of the photographs and wrote to Arthur Wright for permission to use the prints in his article. Arthur was shocked by the request. Seeing no reason to refuse a celebrity, he gave his consent but rejected any offer of compensation. He still didn't believe the images were anything historic and didn't want to appear shady. Agreement in hand, Gardner reached out to the family and conducted interviews. Probably through letters, nothing face-to-face. For a busy man like Gardner, there was very little reason to. The photos were far more interesting than the photographers themselves. The notes taken of the quote-unquote research support this. Quote, Elsie was playing with the gnome and beckoning it to come onto her knee. The gnome leapt up just as Francis, who had the camera, snapped the shutter. He is described as wearing black tights, a reddish jersey, and a pointed bright red cap. Elsie said there was no perceptible weight, though when on the bare hand, the feeling is like a little breath. The wings were more moth-like than the fairies and of a soft neutral tint. Elsie explained that what seemed to be markings on his wings are simply his pipes, which he was swinging in his grotesque little left hand. The coloring of the fairies was described by the girls as shades of green, lavender, and mauve, most marked in the wings and fading to almost pure white in the limbs and drapery. Impressed by the family's refusal of profit, Gardner found the Wrights to be honest and respectable, but also dumb as a box of hammers. In spite of Arthur's expertise in both the technology and the circumstances behind the photos, he still considered him a country bumpkin and ignored his warnings that the images were not as they seemed. Compared to the paranormal scholar, what did he know? While exchanging letters with the Wrights, Gardner and Conan Doyle sought another expert opinion from Kodak. Several of the company's technicians examined the enhanced prints, and although they agreed with Snelling that the pictures showed no signs of being faked, they concluded that the lack of physical alteration could not be taken as conclusive proof of their legitimacy either. While they didn't elaborate on the precise method employed by the girls, possibly because they couldn't figure out how they pulled it off either, they made it clear the camera didn't lie, but it also didn't tell the entire story either. Gardner rejected their opinion at once, believing the technicians were biased and their examination flawed. So he took them to Kodak competitor Ilford, who, without going into detail, reported some evidence of fakery was detectable. Which to Gardner only meant they too weren't objective. Eager for an endorsement, Conan Doyle showed the photographs to spiritualist colleague Sir Oliver Lodge. Like the other learned experts, the physicist and psychical researcher was at a loss how the girls managed to do it, but agreed they were faked. If he had to take a guess, he thought that perhaps the children employed a troupe of dancers to masquerade as fairies, pointing to their distinctly Parisian hairstyles. In spite of having struck down 3 times, Gardner and Conan Doyle kept searching for a way to back their baloney. While not prepared to admit it, both probably knew they'd painted themselves into a corner. They had no one to blame but themselves. In their rush to come out as the discoverers of fairies, they'd overextended themselves. What's more, they continued to tout their false narrative, claiming the pictures were confirmed by experts as genuine. That put the pair at a crossroads. They could issue a correction and walk back the enthusiasm, pending further verification, or they could proceed full speed ahead and let things come to their natural conclusion. An admittedly dumb strategy, a possibility nonetheless. They chose door number 2. Gardner visited the family with 2 W. Butcher & Sons cameras and 24 secretly marked photographic plates. He pleaded with the girls to take more pictures, and Elsie and Frances were in a predicament. Put yourself in their shoes. You told a fib, a silly yarn that at the time drove your parents so nuts they were speechless. It was hilarious, epic, and you got away with it scot-free. The only thing better is occasionally rubbing it in their face. Just imagine, after telling you to take your socks off a sofa 12 times, your parent asks you why you haven't done it yet. Your response? I did. The fairies must have put them back. Want me to take a picture and show you? But now the joke has gotten out of hand. Now other grown-ups are involved. Important grown-ups. And they're pushing you to keep up the act. What could they do? If they came clean, not only would they be in a fair amount of trouble for the stunt, but for embarrassing their families as well. If they played along, the strangers might go away. It wasn't a hard decision. So the girls obliged, returning to the stream to take more photographs. But they added a few new rules to protect their secret. No one could watch them. The fairies wouldn't come out if they did. If this seemingly convenient statute was questioned, the girls had a ready-made explanation. One which was just as absurd. They had been alone every other time they captured the fairies on film, hadn't they? The weather was rainy and unsuitable for photography until August 19th, 1920. The family remained inside, and the girls set out. A few hours later, they returned with 2 photographs of fairies. The first showed Frances nose to nose with a winged creature, and the other showed a fairy giving Elsie a flower. 2 days later, the girls went out again and took another picture, one of Fairies and their sunbath. The Wrights packed up the plates and returned them to London, where Gardner sent an ecstatic telegram to Doyle. "The Fairy is standing almost still, poised on the bush leaves," he wrote as he described photo number 4. The wings were shot with yellow. He also disclosed more preconceptions, although he probably didn't notice, writing, "An interesting point is shown in this photograph. Elsie is not looking directly at the sprite. The reason seems to be that the human eye is disconcerting. If the fairy be actively moving, it doesn't matter much. But if motionless and aware of being gazed at, then the nature spirit will usually withdraw and apparently vanish. With fairy lovers, the habit of looking at first a little sideways is common." Not to be outdone when it came to self-delusion, Conan Doyle concurred, noting, "We have had continued messages at seances for some time that a visible message was coming through." So what makes an educated, accomplished man completely ignore all the signs around him in favor of believing the absurd? Like most links in the chain of events, it had a lot more to do with him than the girls. Over the years, with the success of Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle grew used to being confused with the iconic character and bought into his own press. But he wasn't as smart as he thought he was. It not only gave him an overinflated perception of his own intelligence, but a tendency to underestimate that of other people as well, especially people he felt were socially beneath him. This was especially true of people who were poorer, younger, or from the sticks. He made a lot of generalizations, many of which found their way into his writing. Considering the number of average Joes who owed their fictional futures to his favorite character, it's easy to deduce his opinion of the working class. The fact that the photographers were children, and girls at that, only cemented his resolve. There was no way they could have fooled him. At least, not in his mind. Which is probably why he didn't choose to visit Cottingley or the Wrights himself. It was more than just a full schedule that kept him away. Conan Doyle traveled around the globe to attend various seances and conduct interviews. Again, this is probably due to his belief that the discovery was important, not those responsible. There's also something to be said for the scientific standards of the time. The scientific method was in its infancy, far from public knowledge. Altering findings to suit the desired conclusions was commonplace, and the concept of peer review almost non-existent. Access to raw data, whatever there may be, required connections. So, when Conan Doyle said the photographs underwent a thorough investigation, it was difficult to challenge. And the more he wrote, the more he reinforced that certainty. Which makes another little tidbit even more shocking. His family's creative legacy was built on fairies. Conan Doyle's father, Charles Altamont Doyle, was an illustrator known for his fanciful depictions of fae folk, and his uncle Richard's drawings for the book In Fairyland, a series of pictures from the elf world, were widely known. Conan Doyle was very knowledgeable of how art characterized the fictional beings. The only reasonable explanation for how he missed all of this was that he chose to ignore it. Instead, he poured his convictions into his article for The Strand, not so subtly titled, "Fairies Photographed, an Epic Making Event." Thankfully, he was a little more reserved when it came to protecting the Wrights' privacy, calling the family the Carpenters and referring to Elsie and Frances as Iris and Alice. Along with what he called the most astounding photographs ever published, Conan Doyle declared the discovery a historic moment of divine heraldry. Quote, "With fuller knowledge and with a fresh means of vision, these people are destined to become just as solid and real as the Eskimos." And suddenly, the girls were famous. After its release, fairy fever gripped the nation. The article sold out in Britain and went on to be published in Australia and the United States, where it continued to spread in notoriety and controversy. Public reaction was polarized. Some accepted the images as genuine, others as poppycock. But the hook that kept people talking was that even those who suspected fakery couldn't understand how they'd done it. Skeptics pointed to the many inconsistencies with the photos. Namely, why Frances wasn't looking at the fairies in the first shot. Why one of the fairies didn't have wings where another one did. Why Elsie's hand appeared strangely elongated in another image. And of course, why the beings looked like little bits of paper. Proponents of the pictures offered Gardner's initial interviews in response. Frances's gaze was due to being so used to the fairies that they often paid them no attention. Elsie's deformed hand was blamed on a camera slant. The answers were edited, of course, but it didn't alter anything. Even in their rough draft form, they still seemed as absurd as the photos themselves. But despite this, there remained a significant group who continued to believe, and the photos continued to attract more. And either way, they still grabbed attention. No one could deny that. Conan Doyle used the photos again in 1921 to illustrate a second article in The Strand where he described other accounts of fairy sightings. While the second article contained even more conjecture, including debate on whether or not the girls managed to capture a picture of a sprite's belly button, and whether or not that anatomical detail suggested that they gave birth in a manner similar to humans, he made good on his plans to use the photos to propel his other spiritualist beliefs. Quote, "I have always held that people insist too much upon direct proof. What direct proof have we of most of the great facts of science? Only the ignorant and inexperienced are in total opposition, and the humblest witness, who has really sought the evidence, has more weight than they." Blowback for the article was immediate, but not devastating. Because of his high status as a mystery writer and the affection for his work, most readers tempered their outrage or rationalized it as a quirky embarrassment. Either way, he didn't care. He was certain he was right. And if being the butt of a few jokes was the cost he had to pay to convert the masses, then to him, it was worth it. Gardner made a final visit to Cottingley in late August 1921. This time, in addition to more cameras and photographic plates, he brought a friend. The famed occultist and spiritualist superstar, Geoffrey Hodson. By now, Elsie and Frances were beyond tired of fairies. But they politely humored their guests, hoping that if they played along, that would be the end of it. When Gardner pressed them, they pretended to search before telling him they couldn't find any. And since the fairies were gone, they wouldn't be able to take any more photos. What a shame. Gardner was disappointed, but not discouraged. The fairy industry now had wings of its own. Hodson claimed to see fairies everywhere. Posing for a publicity shot with the psychic, the girls couldn't help but feel disgusted with the stranger. Just another fake eager to insert himself in the same trap they themselves couldn't escape. Hodson went on to produce volumes of observations for the society. For a fee, of course. In 1922, Conan Doyle pushed his rhetoric again in his book, The Coming of the Fairies, The Cottingley Incident, where he expanded upon the so-called evidence, as well as tales of other fairy sightings from around the world. Readers were skeptical, not only for the subject matter, but the gullibility of its author, who appeared more and more unhinged all the time. But Gardner remained all in, and the two men even tried to produce a documentary on the subject, but were never able to get it off the ground. Even among spiritualists, investors balked. It was just too big a gamble. Eventually, the grief and trauma of the war subsided, and the public lost interest in fairies. Belief in the supernatural waned. Both girls grew up, married, and moved on with their lives. But through the years, the photographs continue to hold a curious place in pop culture. Every once in a while, a reporter would track down Elsie or Frances and press them for more details, or badger them to admit they made it up. They dodged as best they could, but the same couldn't be said for the adults in our story. Elsie's mother believed fairies existed in the Beck for the rest of her life, and Conan Doyle and Gardner remained devout believers of the photographs until their deaths. It wasn't until the girls were elderly themselves that they admitted the photographs were faked. As Arthur had deduced, they were cardboard cutouts, nothing more than images copied from a popular children's book, suspended with hat pins. "It was just Elsie and I having a bit of fun," Frances told the BBC in 1985. But just imagine, you're 16 and messing around with your cousin, and the world's most famous writer of the world's most famous, incredibly clever guy comes along and publishes your photographs for the whole world to see, and writes a long tract about how your fun camera experiment is proof positive that fairies exist, and the whole world rests on these photos. Well, what are you going to do? Elsie explained, "The joke was to last 2 hours, and it has lasted 70 years. 2 village kids and a brilliant man like Conan Doyle. Well, we could only keep quiet." "I can't understand to this day why they were taken in," said Frances. "People often say to me, 'Don't you feel ashamed that you've made all these poor people look like fools?' They believed in you." But I do not, because they wanted to believe. Frances died in 1986, and Elsie 2 years later. They were 78 and 87, respectively. No fairies have been seen at their gravesides. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides, too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.